What do you do when your home is burning and help arrives? You get out. You let them work. Unless you're in ancient Rome, where the help doesn't help until you sign. Marcus Licinius Crassus ran the only fire brigade in the city, and his crews carried two things: water and contracts. The water was for after you sold him your property. The contracts were for while you watched it burn. We're stepping into the smoke tonight to experience Rome's firefighting system, where the flames were predictable and the rescue was extortion. Light something you can control, and let's see if you could survive being saved. You wake to screaming. Not the distant kind, not the muffled drama of a lover's quarrel 3 floors up, or the theatrical wailing of a professional mourner passing through the street. This screaming is close. This screaming belongs to Tertius, the fuller who lives in the unit below yours, the one whose workspace always reeks of human urine, because that's what fullers use to clean cloth. You've smelled worse things than Tertius. You're about to smell something much, much worse. Smoke. Not cooking smoke. Not the familiar char of the bakery on the corner burning another batch of yesterday's grain. This smoke is different. Structure smoke has weight to it, texture, intention. It crawls into your nose like it's looking for something. It tastes like everything you own deciding to become ash. You're already moving before your mind catches up. Feet hitting cold tile, hands finding the doorframe in darkness, lungs beginning that tight, panic negotiation with air that's rapidly becoming optional. Your insula. Your home, your vertical slice of Rome's infinite housing crisis, is 5 stories of timber frame, mud brick, and desperate optimism. The walls are thin enough to hear your neighbors argue about fish sauce. They're also thin enough to burn in minutes. The hallway is chaos. Bodies press against you in the darkness. Elbows, shoulders, someone's child crying in sharp little hiccups. The stairs are somewhere ahead, theoretically, if the smoke hasn't already found them. Someone is praying to Vulcan, which feels optimistic. Someone else is praying to anyone. The heat is building at your back, patient and absolute. And then you see them. Torchlight cuts through the haze at the building's entrance. Men. Organized men, with water buckets, with hooks, with the calm efficiency of people who do this regularly. Professional firefighters. Rome's own Vigiles. Or no, not quite. These men wear no official insignia. They're not here from the state. They're here from Marcus Licinius Crassus, the richest man in Rome, and they're not moving. They're waiting. One of them catches your eye through the smoke. He's holding a wax tablet and a stylus. Behind him, the buckets sit full and untouched. "Lovely property," he says, and his voice is somehow calm, conversational, like you're discussing the weather at a dinner party instead of standing in a burning building. Shame about the fire. But we can help. For a price. The price, you will soon learn, is everything. Welcome to Rome's first fire brigade. Try not to choke. Let's step back. Just for a moment, just far enough to breathe. And understand exactly what's burning. You live in the suburb, which is a polite way of saying you live in Rome's armpit. The district sits in a valley between hills, trapping summer heat and winter damp with equal enthusiasm, and it houses the people the city needs but prefers not to think about. Fullers, tanners, prostitutes, freedmen, laborers, and you. A craftsman of modest success who has spent 15 years building something that looks almost like stability. Your insula rises 7 stories into air that never quite smells clean. This is technically illegal. Augustus himself will eventually limit building heights to 70 feet, but Augustus isn't born yet, and your landlord isn't particularly concerned with regulations. The ground floor is stone. A tavern, a shop, storage that floods in heavy rain. Everything above is wood. Wooden frames, wooden floors, wooden stairs that groan in ways that stop scaring you around year 3. Your apartment is on the 4th floor, which means you're too high to escape easily and too low to be the last to burn. You share a wall with a family of 6 and a ceiling with a man who keeps chickens in his room. The rent is almost reasonable. The view is mostly other insulae stacked so close you could pass bread to your neighbor without leaving your window. Every resident cooks over open flame. Every resident lights their home with oil lamps. Every resident has stacked flammable possessions in flammable rooms inside a flammable building, because the alternative is owning nothing in the street. Fire isn't a risk in the Sabora. Fire is a when. You've spent 15 years knowing this. You've spent 15 years keeping water near your brazier, watching your children around flames, waking at odd hours to check that nothing's smoldering. You've spent 15 years knowing that everything you own, your tools, your inventory, the small savings you've hidden in a gap behind the wall, the bed your children were born in, all of it is kindling in waiting. And now the waiting is over. Your entire life, your entire identity, everything that separates you from the beggars at the temple gates, it's all becoming heat and light and ash. And the men who could stop it are standing outside, watching, waiting for a man with a tablet to finish his walk. You make it to the street. The stairs were a nightmare of smoke and heat and stumbling bodies. Other residents pouring down from upper floors, some carrying children, some carrying valuables, one man inexplicably carrying a chair. The ground floor is chaos. People spilling into the narrow street, looking up at the building they used to live in as flames begin to lick from upper windows, and there they are. Crassus's men, 500 of them if the rumors are true. 500 slaves trained specifically for this work, equipped with everything necessary to fight a fire in the ancient world. They have buckets, not the sad household kind, but large, professional vessels designed for passing hand to hand in chains. They have hooks on long poles for pulling down burning timbers before they can spread the fire. They have thick blankets soaked in vinegar, which everyone knows smothers flames better than water. They have ladders. They have axes. They have ropes and pulleys and the organized discipline of men who do this every night. Because in Rome, something is always burning. They're doing nothing. They stand in their formations, buckets ready, hooks resting on shoulders, watching the building with the detached interest of people who have seen this exact scene 100 times. One of them, a large man with burn scars on his forearms, glances at you with something that might be pity. Then he looks away. The man with the tablet has reached you. He's dressed well, though not extravagantly. The clothes of a prosperous freedman, probably someone who handles business for someone richer. His face is calm, patient, professionally sympathetic. He's done this before. He's done this so many times that your burning home is simply Tuesday. Do you own property in this building? His voice is pleasant, conversational. Behind you, something crashes. A floor collapsing, timber giving way. And someone screams in a way that will visit your dreams for years. Fourth floor. I own the lease. Excellent. He makes a note on his tablet. I represent Marcus Licinius Crassus, who, as you may know, maintains the finest fire brigade in Rome. We would be happy to assist in saving your property. The flames are spreading. You can feel the heat on your back, prickling your skin even from the street. Your wife is clutching your youngest so tightly the child has stopped crying and started whimpering. Then help. Put it out. The man smiles. It's not cruel, exactly. It's just business. We would be delighted to. Once you've agreed to sell. He names a price. It's roughly 1/10 of what your apartment was worth. The number sits in the air between you while your life burns. I can't. That's nothing. It's something, he says reasonably. And in about 4 minutes, I estimate it will be more than the ashes will fetch. Shall we discuss? The negotiation has rules. You don't know them, but he does. Rule 1. Time is not on your side. Every minute you spend arguing, the fire spreads. Every minute the fire spreads, the value of your property drops. He knows this. He has calculated it, probably, with the cold precision of a man who has watched enough buildings burn to understand exactly how flame travels through Roman construction. The offer stands at 2,000 sesterces, he says, checking something on his tablet. For the complete transfer of your lease and all claims to the property, 2,000 sesterces. You could buy a decent slave for 2,000 sesterces. You could not buy 15 years of your life, the tools of your trade, the savings hidden in the wall, the future you were building for your children. It's worth 20 times that. It was worth 20 times that. He corrects gently. About 10 minutes ago. Currently, I'd estimate market value at perhaps 15,000, declining rapidly. In another 5 minutes, he pauses, tilting his head as another section of roof collapses with a sound like the world ending. Perhaps 10,000. In 10 minutes, the structure will likely be unsalvageable, at which point we'll be discussing land value only. Your daughter is coughing. The smoke is thickening, even in the street, and ash is falling like gray snow. Somewhere above, you can hear voices. People still trapped, still hoping, still dying. You could save them now, you hear yourself say. You could put it out now, and we could, he agrees. That's precisely what we're offering to do. For a reasonable consideration. 15,000. Your voice sounds strange. Distant. I'll sell for 15,000. He shakes his head slowly, almost sadly. I'm afraid the offer has adjusted. Given the progression of the fire, I can now authorize 1,800 sesterces. It went down. The building went up. Same principle, different direction. He gestures vaguely at the flames now visible through your fourth floor window. Your window, your home, your life. Every moment of delay costs you value, friend. That's simply mathematics. You think about hospitals, suddenly. A strange thought to have while your home burns, but it surfaces anyway. Those stories you've heard about the Greek physicians, how they charge more when the patient is sicker, how desperation has a price that compounds by the hour. This is that. This is the same calculation, the same extraction, the same understanding that human beings will pay anything to save what they love. Medical debt, disaster loans, the way the price of bread rises during sieges. Different fires, same negotiation. 1,600 sesterces, he says, and you realize he's been talking while you weren't listening. I really can't go lower. Well, I can, but I don't think you want me to. Your wife's hand finds yours. Her grip is crushing. She doesn't say anything. She doesn't have to. You both know what happens next. But you're not ready. Not yet. You try one more time. Please. The children. Just save what you can, and we'll 1,400 sesterces. His voice is still pleasant, still patient. The fourth floor is fully involved now. We're negotiating third floor value at best. Behind you, Crassus's fire brigade stands motionless, ready, waiting. The man with the burn scars hasn't looked at you again. This is the moment. You feel it arrive with terrible clarity. The moment where you stop fighting and start surviving. The moment where you accept that the system is designed so that you lose, and the only choice is how much. Let's pause here, just for a breath, just long enough to understand who's burning your life down. Marcus Licinius Crassus is not, technically, setting these fires. He's simply benefiting from them with remarkable consistency. The distinction matters legally, if not morally. He was born into a good family. Not the best, but respectable enough. His father was a consul, which should have guaranteed him a comfortable path through Roman politics. Instead, he got the civil wars, the proscriptions, the chaos that turns comfortable into corpse with very little warning. Crassus survived. His father didn't. His brother didn't. Crassus hid in a cave in Spain for 8 months, living off supplies that a family friend secretly provided, waiting for the political winds to shift. When they did, he emerged with nothing but his name and an absolute bone-deep understanding that the only security in this world is wealth. Obscene, ungodly, impossible to ignore wealth. He started building it immediately. The fire brigade was genius, really. Rome burned constantly. The combination of open flames, crowded housing, no municipal services, and summer heat guaranteed a steady supply of desperation. Crassus simply organized that desperation into profit. He bought 500 slaves, trained them in firefighting techniques, equipped them with the best tools available, and sent them out every night to find burning buildings. Not to save them, to acquire them. The method was simple. Arrive fast, assess the situation, make an offer. If the owner accepts, save what you can. If they refuse, watch it burn, then buy the land from whoever inherits the ashes. Either way, Crassus wins. Either way, his holdings grow. Within a decade, he owned more of Rome than anyone in history. Tenement blocks, commercial properties, warehouses, workshops. A portfolio built one fire at a time, one desperate signature at a time. Plutarch, writing a century later, would estimate his fortune at approximately 200 million sesterces. Modern historians convert this to somewhere between $2 and $8 billion, depending on how you measure Roman currency against modern purchasing power. $2 billion, built on smoke. He didn't stop there, of course. He bought silver mines worked by slaves under conditions so brutal that death rates were measured by the month. He bought politicians. Literally bought them, paying their debts, financing their campaigns, collecting their loyalty like rent. He formed the first triumvirate with Pompey and Caesar, 3 men who together controlled Rome simply by controlling its money. Crassus wanted more than money eventually. He wanted military glory, the one thing wealth couldn't quite purchase. He would march an army into Parthia, modern-day Iran, seeking a victory to match his fortune. The Parthians captured him. They knew who he was. Who doesn't know the richest man in Rome? According to legend, they executed him by pouring molten gold down his throat. A fitting end, they thought, for a man whose greed had defined his life. But that's later. That's decades away. Right now, in this moment, Crassus is simply the richest man in the world, and his representative is standing in front of your burning home, and the price has just dropped again. 1,200 sesterces, the man says. Final offer. The tablet is in your hands. You're not entirely sure how it got there. The last few minutes have been a blur of smoke and numbers and your daughter coughing and the terrible, patient voice of the man who represents the richest monster in Rome. 1,200 sesterces. For everything. For your life. The wax is warm from proximity to the fire. The stylus is smooth, well-used, comfortable in the hand. How many signatures has this thing collected? How many families have stood where you're standing, smoke in their lungs, desperation in their hearts, scratching their names into wax because the alternative was ash? You can't read the full text. Your Latin isn't good enough for legal documents, and even if it were, your eyes are streaming too badly to focus. You catch words: transfer, property, consideration, irrevocable. The bones of your surrender, dressed in official language. Your wife's hand is still in yours. She squeezes once. Permission? Forgiveness? Simple contact in the face of ruin? You'll never know. You'll never ask. You sign. The man takes the tablet back, examines your mark, nods once with professional satisfaction. He raises his hand. A simple gesture, almost casual, and everything changes. The fire brigade moves. They've been ready this whole time, you realize. Positioned, prepared, waiting for exactly this signal. The bucket chains form instantly, water appearing from cisterns you hadn't noticed, flowing hand to hand with mechanical precision. The hook teams advance on the building, pulling down burning timbers before they can spread to neighboring structures. Wet blankets fly through the air, smothering flames, steaming and hissing as they make contact. They're good. They're really terrifyingly good. Within minutes, the fire that was consuming your life is controlled. Not out, but managed. Dying rather than growing. The upper floors are gone. Nothing can save those. But the structure itself might survive. Your apartment, or what's left of it, might even be habitable. You'll never know. It's not yours anymore. Someone will be by tomorrow to discuss the transition, the man says, tucking his tablet under his arm. You'll be permitted to collect personal effects, assuming the building is stable. Rent terms are standard for the district. Quite reasonable, actually. Crassus isn't unreasonable. He walks away before you can respond. Not quickly. There's no need for speed now. The negotiation is complete. The forms are signed. You're just another entry in a ledger, another property acquired, another family that learned what survival costs in Rome. The fire dies. The smoke thins. Dawn begins to gray the eastern sky. You are alive. Your family is alive. And tomorrow, you will return to the apartment that used to be yours and pay rent to the man who watched it burn. You wonder, in the days that follow, whether you should have refused. You hear about the ones who did. Everyone hears about them eventually. The stories travel through the Sabora like smoke, whispered in taverns and workshops, cautionary tales dressed as gossip. There was a landlord on the Aventine who told Crassus's man to go to hell. Told him that his building would survive, that the fire wasn't that bad, that he'd rather lose everything than submit to extortion. He was wrong about all of it. The building burned to the foundation. His wife died on the stairs. His children survived only because a neighbor dragged them through a window. 2 days later, a different representative from Crassus appeared at his door. The man was renting a room by then, sleeping on a borrowed floor, trying to figure out how to rebuild from nothing. The representative made an offer for the land. Just the land, just the burned-out lot where his home used to be. The offer was less than half what Crassus's man had proposed during the fire. He sold anyway. What choice did he have? The land was worth nothing to him without capital to rebuild, and his capital was ash. Crassus got the property for even less than his original lowball offer, and all it cost was a woman's life and a few extra hours. There are other stories. A merchant who negotiated too long and lost everything when the roof came down. A freedman who spat in the representative's face and then watched his children burn because the fire brigade had orders. Always specific, always clear. To save nothing belonging to those who refused. A widow who held out for a better price until the flames reached the room where she kept her savings, at which point there was nothing left to negotiate for. The system has no cracks. That's what you learn, listening to these stories. That's what Crassus understood building it. You can refuse the first offer, and they'll make a lower one. You can refuse all offers, and they'll buy from your heirs. You can die refusing, and they'll acquire the land from the city itself, logged as abandoned property, claimed for a fraction of its value. Refusal isn't resistance. It's just slower surrender with worse terms. Some people whisper about the fires themselves. How certain buildings seem to burn more often than others. How Crassus's brigade always arrives so quickly, almost as if they knew where to go. How some fires start in strange places. Storerooms that should have been empty, upper floors where no one was cooking. No one can prove anything. No one ever will. Rome has no fire investigators, no forensic techniques, no way to distinguish arson from accident in a city where accident is constant. If Crassus's agents sometimes helped the flames along, if certain properties were targeted for acquisition and encouraged to burn, the evidence turned to ash along with everything else. You'll never know if your fire was natural or arranged. You'll spend the rest of your life wondering, and the wondering will keep you up at night, and it won't change anything. The building burned. You signed. Crassus won. That's the only story that matters. Dawn finds you sitting on a stranger's step. Your family is with you. All of them, alive, breathing, coughing occasionally from lungs that may never fully forgive last night. Your wife hasn't spoken since you signed. Your children are too young to understand what happened and too old not to sense that something is terribly wrong. Your youngest is finally asleep, exhausted past the capacity for fear. You have the clothes you're wearing, a small pouch with a few coins that were in your belt when you fled, a wooden spoon your daughter was clutching when you pulled her from bed. She won't let go of it, and you don't have the heart to ask why. That's everything. That's your entire wealth in the world. The Suburra is waking up around you, beginning its normal rhythms of commerce and chaos. Street vendors setting up their stalls, laborers heading to the docks, children running errands, beggars finding their spots, the vast machinery of Roman poverty lurching into motion for another day. Some of them glance at you with recognition, not of you personally, but of your situation. The ash-stained clothes, The hollow eyes, the particular quality of stillness that comes from losing everything between one breath and the next. They've seen your type before. Some of them have been your type before. No one offers help. What would they offer? They have nothing to spare, and charity doesn't pay rent. Later today, you'll return to your building. Crassus's men have already been there. You can see the work crews in the distance, assessing damage, calculating repairs, preparing the property for its new role as rental income. They're efficient. They've done this before. Your home will be habitable again within a week, probably patched and cleaned and ready for tenants. Tenants like you. The rent will be reasonable, the representative said. Standard for the district. You'll pay monthly to live in the rooms you used to own, watching your money flow to a man who built his fortune by watching families burn. The arrangement will last until you can't pay anymore, at which point you'll be evicted and someone else will take your place, and the cycle will continue. This is Rome. This is the system. This is survival. Across the city, other columns of smoke are rising. Last night's fires burning themselves out. Other families waking to the same dawn you're facing. Crassus's ledgers will grow fatter today. His representatives are already out, probably, assessing new acquisitions, counting new properties, building an empire one tragedy at a time. 50 years from now, Augustus will create the Vigiles, a public fire brigade 7,000 strong, funded by the state and obligated to save everyone regardless of wealth or willingness to sell. It will be too late for you, too late for your children, possibly too late for your grandchildren. But eventually, the system will change. Not because it was wrong, because it was inefficient. Because a Rome that burned constantly was a Rome that couldn't grow, couldn't build, couldn't become the empire it was meant to become. Augustus will fix the fire problem not out of compassion but out of practicality. That's how these things always end. Not with justice, with accounting. You stand up. Your legs ache. Your lungs ache. Everything aches. Time to go negotiate your rent. Let's step back. Let's breathe. Let's return to a place where the smoke is metaphorical and the flames are paperwork. You survived. That's something. That's not nothing. In a world that offered you the choice between ruin and death, you chose ruin, and you lived to rebuild from the ashes. Even if the ashes were literally yours, even if the rebuilding means paying rent to your own destroyer. But here's the thing about Crassus. He wasn't special. Oh, he was exceptionally good at what he did. He systematized cruelty in a way that most people only dream of. He built infrastructure for extraction, created processes for desperation, turned human suffering into a business model with documented procedures and trained employees. He was, in modern terms, a disruptor. But he didn't invent the principle. He just refined it. The principle is simple. Find people at their most vulnerable and negotiate from that vulnerability. Find the moment when someone will agree to anything and be there with a contract. Don't cause the disaster, or at least don't get caught causing it, but always be ready to profit from it. You know this principle. You've seen it. It's the hospital that quotes you a price while you're lying on a gurney, unsure if you're dying, unable to shop for alternatives or negotiate from strength. It's the insurance adjuster who shows up after the hurricane with an offer that's a fraction of your coverage. Knowing that you need cash now, knowing that fighting will take years you don't have. It's the payday lender who sets up shop in the poor neighborhood. The diploma mill that targets veterans, the timeshare salesman who catches tourists at their most relaxed and least defended. It's every system that has learned what Crassus knew. Desperation has a price, and that price can be quantified, optimized, extracted at scale. We like to think we've evolved past this. We have regulations now, consumer protections, agencies with acronyms designed to prevent the worst abuses. And sometimes they work. Sometimes the fire brigade actually puts out the fire without demanding your signature first. But the principle survives. The principle always survives because it's not about morality. It's about mathematics. As long as someone can profit from your worst moment, someone will. Crassus died with gold in his throat, if the legends are true. A poetic end for a man who loved gold more than people, who built an empire on the understanding that everyone has a price and fire reveals it faster than anything else. But his methods didn't die with him. They just changed addresses, changed names, got better lawyers and more sophisticated accounting. The fire brigade is still out there somewhere. They're still standing in formation, holding their buckets, waiting for the moment when you'll sign anything to make the burning stop. They're just wearing different uniforms now. So the next time you find yourself negotiating from desperation, medical bills, disaster loans, any of the 1,000 small fires that modern life sets beneath us, remember the sabura. Remember the smoke in your lungs and the man with the tablet and the terrible patient mathematics of your surrender. Remember that you're not the first person to stand in those flames. And remember that survival sometimes looks like losing, and losing sometimes looks like the only way through. Crassus built his fortune on that knowledge. The least we can do is understand it. Stay warm out there. And maybe keep a bucket handy, just in case. The popular image of the medieval food taster is almost charming in its simplicity. A nervous servant takes a delicate bite of the king's roast pheasant, chews thoughtfully, waits approximately 3 dramatic minutes while everyone stares, and then, assuming they don't collapse into spectacular death throes, dinner is served. It's tidy. It's theatrical. It's also completely inadequate protection against anyone with half a brain and access to a decent apothecary. Here's the problem that medieval monarchs understood perfectly well, even if the popular imagination hasn't caught up. Why would any serious assassin use a fast-acting poison? Arsenic, the darling of medieval murderers, could take days to kill. Certain plant extracts worked over weeks, mimicking the symptoms of common illnesses so effectively that physicians would shake their heads sadly and blame the patient's humors. Lead accumulated slowly, sweetly, invisibly. Competent poisoner wasn't looking to create a dramatic dining room collapse. They wanted their target to sicken gradually, die in bed surrounded by bewildered doctors, and leave no obvious evidence of foul play. The 3-minute taster test catches exactly one category of assassination attempt: the stupid kind. Medieval kings were many things: paranoid, violent, occasionally spectacularly inbred. But they were not, as a general rule, stupid about their own survival. They knew the taster system had holes large enough to drive a funeral procession through. They knew their enemies had access to the same botanical knowledge they did. They knew that the servant taking a careful nibble of their dinner was, at best, protection against the most incompetent class of murderer. So, what did they actually build? What emerged in royal courts across Europe wasn't a simple tasting ritual. It was an elaborate, multi-layered security apparatus that would make modern intelligence agencies nod in professional appreciation. The food taster was just the visible tip of an iceberg that extended deep into kitchen operations, servant surveillance, chemical detection, supply chain documentation, and intelligence gathering. The paranoia was justified. The solutions were ingenious. And the real story of how medieval monarchs protected themselves from poison is darker, weirder, and far more conspiratorial than the simple image of a servant and a spoon. Grab something to drink. Preferably something you poured yourself. Consider the silver spoon. Gleaming, elegant, catching candlelight across the banquet table. The obvious interpretation is wealth display. The rich ate with precious metals because they could, because it impressed visiting dignitaries, because ostentation was the medieval equivalent of a power move. The less obvious interpretation is that silver was a poison detection system disguised as table setting. Silver reacts chemically with arsenic and various sulfur compounds that were common ingredients in period poisons. Expose a silver spoon to arsenical contamination, and it doesn't stay gleaming. It tarnishes, darkens, develops a telltale discoloration that announces something has gone very wrong with the soup course. The metal literally changes color in the presence of certain toxins. Royal households didn't choose silver tableware despite its reactivity. They chose it because of its reactivity. Servants in sophisticated courts were trained to examine utensils between courses, watching for the subtle shift in surface sheen that might indicate contamination. A spoon that went into the sauce bright and came out darkened was not simply dirty. It was evidence. The entire table setting became a distributed chemical testing apparatus, each piece of silverware serving double duty as both eating implement and early warning system. The sensory experience of this surveillance was quietly horrible. Imagine being the servant whose job was to retrieve each spoon, each knife, each serving implement, and scrutinize it under candlelight while the court waited. The silver catches the flame. The surface shows something. Is that tarnish? Is that shadow? Is that the normal discoloration of metal exposed to food acids, or is that the specific darkening that means someone in the kitchen just committed high treason? The stakes of reading tarnish patterns correctly were exactly as high as they sound. Arsenic was popular among medieval poisoners precisely because it was accessible, tasteless when properly prepared, and could mimic natural illness. It was so commonly used that courts developed an entire material culture around detecting it. Silver services, specialized testing implements, trained observation protocols. The gleaming table settings of royal banquets weren't just beautiful. They were the first line of a deeply paranoid defense system. And they were only the beginning. The food taster took their ceremonial bite, chewed, swallowed, and waited. But the waiting wasn't passive, and it certainly wasn't brief. In many courts, what followed was considerably less dignified than the popular imagination suggests. If a taster reported any unusual sensation, any strange tingling, any unexpected bitterness, any subtle wrongness in how the food sat, the protocol wasn't to wait and see if they died. The protocol was to make them vomit immediately. Ipecac root, syrup of squill, various emetic herbs kept specifically for this purpose. Court physicians maintained supplies designed to empty a stomach as quickly and thoroughly as possible. The theory was grimly practical. If poison had been ingested, getting it out fast improved survival odds. And if the taster's strange sensation was just nervous imagination, well, better to purge unnecessarily than to discover the hard way that the roast had been seasoned with something fatal. The vomit itself was then examined. This is where medieval food security crossed from merely paranoid into genuinely forensic. Physicians would inspect the expelled contents, looking for unusual colors, strange consistite textures, evidence of substances that shouldn't be present in properly prepared food. They were essentially conducting primitive toxicology on regurgitated dinner while the king waited to find out if he could eat. Some courts kept tasters in observation for hours after meals. Not the brief dramatic pause of popular imagination, but extended surveillance periods during which the taster was watched for any developing symptoms. Headache, nausea, changes in complexion, unusual sweating. The slow-acting poisons that could evade immediate detection might still reveal themselves through subtle physiological changes if someone was paying close enough attention. The physical toll on professional tasters was considerable. The job meant existing in a constant cycle of eating, potential purging, and medical scrutiny. It meant living with the knowledge that every meal might require violent expulsion of one's stomach contents while court physicians peered at the results. It meant being essentially a human laboratory animal with excellent table manners. The compensation was good. The job security, paradoxically, was not. But even controlled vomiting and extended observation had limitations. Some poisons didn't produce immediate symptoms at any dose. Some worked too slowly to be caught by even hours of watching. The taster system needed additional layers. Enter the kitchen security apparatus. Step into the royal kitchen, and the atmosphere shifts from banquet elegance to something closer to a military installation. The heat hits first. Massive hearths burning continuously, creating an environment that was equal parts workplace and slow roasting hell. The noise comes second. Shouted orders, clanging pots, the constant percussion of food preparation at institutional scale. But the most striking feature of a properly secured royal kitchen wasn't the heat or the noise. It was the guards. Armed men stationed throughout the cooking space, positioned specifically to watch the hands of every cook, every assistant, every servant who touched ingredients or implements. Their job wasn't to protect the kitchen from external threats. It was to watch the people inside it. Every movement observed. Every potential moment of contamination witnessed. The cooks worked under constant surveillance from men whose specific assignment was to ensure nothing unauthorized went into the king's food. The paranoia extended to ingredient storage. Spice cabinets, where poison could most easily hide among the powerful flavors of medieval seasoning, required multiple keys held by different officials. No single person could access the pepper, the cinnamon, the exotic imports that might disguise the taste of something lethal. Opening a spice cabinet required a small ceremony of key holders, each one serving as a check on the others. The pantries operated under similar logic. Ingredients locked away, access documented, guards watching cooks. The supply chain from delivery to preparation was mapped with obsessive detail. Each handoff witnessed and recorded. And the cooks themselves? Many were effectively prisoners of their profession. In some courts, kitchen staff were forbidden from leaving the palace grounds. They lived in supervised quarters, their movements tracked, their associations monitored. The logic was brutal but coherent. A cook who couldn't be reached by outside conspirators couldn't be bribed or threatened into cooperation. Some courts went further, holding cooks' families as de facto hostages. Insurance against treachery, the unspoken threat that betrayal would have consequences beyond the individual traitor. The kitchen wasn't a workplace. It was a black site with better smells and considerably more vegetable chopping. The people who fed the king existed in a state of permanent suspicion. Their loyalty tested daily through the simple mechanism of observation so thorough that concealing treachery became nearly impossible. Nearly, not entirely. Which is why the system needed yet another layer. Food in a properly paranoid royal court didn't simply travel from kitchen to table. It traveled through a documented chain of custody that would satisfy modern evidence handling protocols. Every person who touched a dish recorded, every transfer witnessed, every handoff noted in writing. The bureaucracy of dinner was genuinely staggering. A dish might pass through a dozen hands between kitchen and king, cook to kitchen supervisor to transport servant to hall steward to presentation servant to taster to final server. At each transfer point, someone was watching and recording. The identity of every person in the chain was documented. If something went wrong, if poison somehow reached the royal plate, the investigation could trace backward through the paperwork, identifying exactly who had access at exactly what moment. Some courts required food to be covered and sealed between stations. Not simply covered with cloth, but physically sealed with wax or cord, the seal checked at each handoff. A broken seal meant the chain had been compromised. The food could not be trusted. The entire dish had to be remade under fresh observation. The elaborate covers and ceremonial dish presentation that survived into later periods as empty ritual began as functional security protocols. This wasn't paranoia without basis. The historical record includes documented assassination attempts that exploited exactly the vulnerabilities this system was designed to prevent. Servants were bribed. Poison was introduced during transport. Kitchen workers were threatened or blackmailed into cooperation. The chain of custody protocol existed because courts had learned, through ugly experience, that the space between pot and plate was a space of maximum vulnerability. Every transfer was an opportunity for contamination. Every unsupervised moment was a moment when the enemy might act. The paperwork was survival. Modern viewers might imagine medieval courts as disorganized, chaotic, operating on tradition rather than procedure. But the food security apparatus tells a different story. One of systematic, documented, rigorously maintained protocols that would be recognizable to any modern security professional. The forms were different. The essential logic was identical. Track everything. Document everyone. Trust no one. And keep writing it down. Because when the investigation comes, you want the paper trail to show exactly whose hands touched the poison. Among the stranger expenses in royal household accounts, enormous sums paid for unicorn horns. The horns were real objects. Long, spiraling, elegantly twisted, and courts across Europe paid fortunes for them. The belief was that unicorn horn would sweat or change color in the presence of poison, providing magical detection that no human taster could match. Cups were carved from the material. Pieces were dipped into wine before drinking. The unicorn horn was the ultimate poison defense, worth more than its weight in gold. The horns were, of course, narwhal tusks. Narwhals. Arctic whales with a single long spiraling tooth, provided the raw material for this medieval security theater. Merchants who dealt in exotic goods knew exactly what they were selling. The tusks came from northern waters, passed through trading networks, and arrived at European courts labeled as the horns of mythical creatures with magic poison-detecting properties. The scientific detection value was precisely 0. Narwhal ivory does not react to arsenic. It does not change color in the presence of toxic substances. It does not sweat, glow, or otherwise indicate contamination. As a poison detection system, it was completely, magnificently useless. And yet the market flourished for centuries. Why? Here's the real conspiracy. Many of the people maintaining this trade knew perfectly well what they were selling, and the system persisted because the fiction was itself valuable. The psychological deterrent of magical detection served purposes that actual detection couldn't. A potential poisoner who believed the king possessed unicorn horn testing capability might hesitate, might fear discovery through means they couldn't understand or circumvent. The belief in magical protection provided a layer of security that depended entirely on the enemy believing in it too. Church authorities who might have debunked the unicorn myth had reasons not to. The association of unicorns with purity and Christ gave religious sanction to a useful delusion. Crown officials who might have questioned the expense had reasons not to. The visible presence of exotic, expensive magical protection enhanced royal prestige and deterred threats. The unicorn horn market was a conspiracy of convenient fiction, maintained by sellers who knew, buyers who suspected, and a broader culture that found the myth too useful to examine closely. Magic wasn't real. But the security value of people believing in magic, that was very real indeed. All of this elaborate security, the silver testing, the controlled vomiting, the kitchen surveillance, the chain of custody, even the fictional unicorn horns, existed because poisoning attempts succeeded often enough to justify every expense and inconvenience. The system wasn't paranoid delusion. It was barely adequate defense against a real and constant threat. Consider the methods that bypass taster protocols entirely. Slow-acting poisons that produced no immediate symptoms. The taster could eat heartily, submit to observation, show no ill effects, and the king could die 2 weeks later from what appeared to be natural illness. The connection between meal and murder might never be drawn. Some successful poisonings were only identified as such decades later, when political circumstances made confession profitable or historical investigation revealed suspicious patterns. Bribes corrupted the chain. Kitchen staff earning modest wages were offered sums that represented years of income for a moment of looking away. A second of distraction, an opportunity created. The surveillance was thorough but not total. There were always gaps, always moments when the guards were human and fallible and susceptible to exactly the same pressures as the people they watched. Poisons were applied not to food but to specific plates, cups, serving implements. The king's personal dishes, the ones only he used, became targets. Contaminate the plate itself, and no amount of food testing helps. The poison transfers at the moment of service after all the checks have been passed. The threats came from predictable directions: ambitious nobles with claims to succession, foreign powers with geopolitical interests, family members whose affection had curdled into something more practical. The medieval court was an environment of intimate danger, where the people closest to power were also the people best positioned to remove it. Specific historical cases filled the chronicles. Kings who sickened after unremarkable meals. Princes whose health declined suspiciously after political reversals. Queens whose deaths conveniently benefited identifiable parties. Not all were proven poisonings. The ambiguity was part of the terror. But enough were confirmed to establish that the threat was genuine, constant, and capable of penetrating even elaborate defenses. The paranoia wasn't irrational. It was learned through bitter, fatal experience. The security apparatus existed because the alternative was dying. The food taster's position in the household granted access to something far more valuable than the royal menu: the kitchen gossip network. Kitchens in medieval courts were information hubs of extraordinary richness. Servants talked. They talked about which nobles were feuding, which ladies-in-waiting had attracted unwanted attention, which advisors were falling from favor. They talked about delivery schedules that revealed troop movements, about supply requests that indicated coming campaigns, about household shifts that telegraphed political changes before any official announcement. The kitchen heard everything, processed everything, and, crucially, discussed everything among themselves while they worked. The food taster lived in this environment. They ate with the kitchen staff, built relationships with servants across the household, became embedded in a social network that crossed all the usual barriers of rank and access. Their official position gave them legitimate reason to be everywhere food was prepared or served, which meant legitimate reason to be present for conversations that touched every aspect of court life. Many tasters reported to spy masters, not just stewards. The intelligence function was sometimes their primary job, the tasting merely useful cover for being positioned in the information-richest environment in the palace. A skilled intelligence taster could map the bribery networks, identify which servants had been approached by outside interests, and detect conspiracy in its early stages, long before poison reached the experimental phase. The taster's attention to who was talking to whom, whose loyalties had shifted, whose lifestyle had suddenly improved beyond their salary, provided early warning that no chemical test could match. The silver spoons detected arsenic. The taster detected intent. This explains why food tasters were often selected for qualities beyond strong stomachs and loyal dispositions. The position required social intelligence, the ability to build trust with kitchen staff while maintaining separate allegiances, the capacity to observe without appearing to observe. The taster was essentially an embedded agent in the most strategically valuable gossip network in the medieval world. The job title suggested they existed to taste food. The actual function was considerably more complex and considerably more dangerous if discovered. A taster caught reporting to the wrong master could find themselves on the receiving end of exactly the sort of treatment they were supposedly protected against. But that was the job. That had always been the job. The most elegant conspiracy of medieval food security was the conspiracy of mutual silence about what everyone actually knew. Kings couldn't admit the full extent of their vulnerability. To acknowledge that the elaborate apparatus was necessary, that poisoning attempts were frequent, sometimes successful, and came from within their own courts, would undermine the image of royal power and divine protection that legitimized their rule. Better to let the public see the ceremonial taster, the gleaming silver, the appearance of confident dining, while the real security operated in documented obscurity. Potential assassins couldn't admit how difficult the system actually was to penetrate. To acknowledge that medieval courts had developed sophisticated countermeasures would discourage patrons, reduce fees, and eliminate the mystique that made poison seem like a viable political tool. Better to let the world believe it was simple. Buy some arsenic, bribe a servant, wait for results. While the reality involved confronting layer after layer of detection, surveillance, and documentation. And the tasters themselves were bound by oaths and practical incentives that meant their real work died with them. To reveal the intelligence function, the security protocols, the elaborate measures behind the ceremonial bite would compromise systems they'd sworn to protect and paint targets on their own backs. Their silence was survival. The entire apparatus existed as a public secret. Everyone who mattered knew. Everyone who mattered pretended not to know. The security theater and the actual security operated simultaneously, each serving different purposes, neither acknowledged directly. This pattern hasn't changed. Modern heads of state travel with food security teams that would be immediately recognizable to medieval paranoids. Ingredients sourced through trusted channels. Preparation witnessed by designated personnel. Chain of custody from kitchen to table. The specific techniques have evolved. Chemical testing has improved considerably since silver spoons and unicorn horns. But the fundamental logic is identical. The people preparing food for the powerful operate under layers of surveillance, documentation, and protocol that most of us never see and aren't supposed to think about. The elaborate precautions exist because the threat exists, has always existed, and shows no signs of disappearing. Medieval food security wasn't primitive superstition dressed up in silver tableware. It was the first systematic attempt to solve a problem that still hasn't been solved. Only managed, mitigated, and concealed behind ceremony that looks simpler than it is. The conspiracy continues. The tasters still don't talk. And somewhere, probably, there's still a spoon turning dark. In the year of our Lord 1198, Pope Innocent III called Christendom to arms. The Holy Land was slipping away. Jerusalem, that most sacred of destinations, remained firmly in Muslim hands. Surely, the faithful would rise. Surely, the knights of Europe would thunder eastward in glorious waves. They did not thunder. They trickled. Here's the thing about holy wars that the stained glass windows conveniently omit. Someone has to pay for them. And it turns out that swearing an oath before God creates significantly less military capacity than, say, having actual money. The Fourth Crusade began not as a spiritual awakening, but as a massively underfunded startup pitching salvation while scrambling for venture capital. The original plan, to the extent that crusades had plans, was almost clever. Rather than march directly at Jerusalem through hostile territory, a strategy that had produced mixed results and considerable death. The Crusades' leaders proposed attacking Egypt first. Control the Nile Delta, the thinking went, and you control the grain supply that fed Muslim armies. Strategic, logical. The kind of plan that looks excellent on parchment. The problem was execution. Or rather, the problem was that execution requires ships, and ships require someone to build them. And builders require payment. The Crusades' leadership. French counts and Flemish nobles with more pedigree than liquidity. Surveyed their options and landed on Venice. Venice, the Serene Republic. The merchant city that had turned Mediterranean trade into an art form and contract law into a weapon. The Crusaders needed transport for 33,500 men, 4,500 horses, and provisions for a year. Venice, they reasoned, could provide this. Venice could indeed. Venice was delighted to provide this. Venice drew up contracts with the enthusiasm of a loan shark who's just spotted a gambling addict. In the counting houses along the Grand Canal, quills scratched against parchment. The smell of harbor tar drifted through open windows. Clerks calculated tonnage, provisions, horse stalls. The numbers were impressive, the terms precise, the signatures irrevocable. The Crusaders had just signed away their autonomy before their army had even assembled. 85,000 silver marks, That was the price. For context, this represented roughly twice the annual revenue of the Kingdom of England. The Crusaders, with characteristic optimism, assumed they would raise the funds. God would provide. Donors would emerge. The faithful would contribute. The faithful contributed somewhat less than anticipated. And so began the holiest of missions. Thousands of men who had sworn oaths to liberate Christ's tomb now found themselves unable to cover their deposit. The contracts were signed. The ships were building, and the money simply wasn't there. This, as they say in financial circles, is what's known as a liquidity problem. Picture, if you will, the Lido. That long sandbar sheltering Venice's lagoon from the Adriatic. In the summer of 1202, it became home to an increasingly desperate tent city of crusaders who had discovered a fundamental truth about medieval contract law. Venice always collects. The arithmetic was merciless. The Crusaders had contracted transport for 33,500 soldiers. Roughly 12,000 actually showed up. The rest had either died en route, lost enthusiasm, or, in a development that would have been comic if it weren't catastrophic, simply sailed directly to the Holy Land from other ports, apparently unaware that their comrades had signed a binding agreement on everyone's behalf. Venice, meanwhile, had delivered exactly what was promised. The Republic had suspended normal commercial operations for 18 months. Venetian merchants had deferred their own profits. The shipyards had produced a fleet capable of transporting an army that no longer existed. And now Venice wanted its 85,000 marks. The Crusaders, camped on the Lido, could produce approximately 51,000. This is the moment where the entire enterprise should have collapsed. A 34,000 mark shortfall, no additional funds forthcoming. An army eating through its provisions while its leaders conducted increasingly frantic whip rounds, knights pawning armor and bishops surrendering plate. It was, by any reasonable measure, over. Enter Enrico Dandolo, Doge of Venice. Dandolo was 93 years old. He was completely blind. Some said from a wound in Constantinople decades earlier. Others from disease, the Venetians themselves from mysterious causes that made for better stories. He had been elected Doge at 84, which in modern terms would be roughly equivalent to naming someone CEO after their second retirement party. He moved slowly. He spoke softly. He had been nursing commercial grievances against the Byzantine Empire for longer than most crusaders had been alive. And he looked at the stranded army on the Lido and saw not a disaster but an opportunity. Venice didn't actually need the money. That's the thing about creditors. The truly powerful ones don't want repayment. They want leverage. 85,000 marks paid in full would have been pleasant. An army of trained killers who owed Venice everything and couldn't leave without Venetian ships. That was priceless. Dandolo made his proposal to the Crusades leaders. The debt would be deferred, not forgiven, merely postponed, rolling forward with interest both financial and otherwise. In exchange, the Crusaders would provide a small service. There was a city called Zara. It had once been Venetian. It was currently causing problems. Perhaps the army of God could attend to it. Zara, it should be noted, was a Christian city. Its ruler, King Emeric of Hungary, had himself taken the Crusaders' cross. Attacking it would mean attacking fellow Crusaders. The Crusades' leaders considered their options. On one hand, excommunication. On the other, starvation on a sandbar. They chose the option that came with provisions. The Adriatic in November is not a gentle sea. Cold rain slashes horizontally. Waves turn ships into instruments of misery. And in November of 1202, a fleet of crusaders sailed not toward Egypt, not toward Jerusalem, but toward a city whose primary sin was failing to remain Venetian. Zara had been part of Venice's coastal empire until it decided, rather inconveniently, that it preferred Hungarian rule. The Republic had been waiting for an opportunity to correct this error. Now, through the miraculous workings of compound interest and strategic debt, that opportunity wore crosses and called itself holy. The moral architecture of the enterprise cracked audibly as the fleet approached. Some crusaders understood exactly what was happening. Simon de Montfort, one of the expedition's more principled participants, refused to participate in the assault. He and his followers withdrew, eventually making their own way to the Holy Land. Others wrote anguished letters. A Cistercian abbot named Guy threatened to excommunicate anyone who attacked a Christian city. Most, however, did the math. They were thousands of miles from home, deep in debt, dependent on Venetian ships for every meal and every mile of progress. What exactly were their alternatives? Swim? The siege of Zara lasted 2 weeks. The city's defenders, watching an army of crusaders assemble siege engines beneath banners decorated with crosses, made the reasonable decision to negotiate. On November 24th, 1202, Zara fell. Pope Innocent III received the news with predictable fury. He had specifically forbidden attacks on Christian territories. His crusade, his grand project to reclaim the Holy Land, had opened its account by sacking a Catholic city belonging to a man who had taken the same vows as the attackers. The Pope excommunicated everyone involved, the entire army, the entire Venetian fleet, Dandolo himself. The excommunication was later partially lifted for the Crusaders, who claimed they had acted under duress. The Venetians, who had acted under the duress of wanting Zara back, remained under the ban. Dandolo is reported to have received this news with approximately the same concern he might have shown for an unfavorable weather forecast. The army wintered in the ruins of a city they had destroyed. Rain dripped through damaged roofs. Soldiers argued, occasionally killed each other, and waited for spring. They were excommunicated crusaders occupying a Christian city they had besieged as payment for a debt they still hadn't actually cleared. Jerusalem was no closer. But a new opportunity was sailing toward them. A Byzantine prince with a proposition that would solve everything. He had money. He had legitimacy. He had a throne waiting to be reclaimed. He had, as it would turn out, absolutely none of these things. But his pitch was spectacular. The young man who arrived at Zara in the winter of 1203 had the desperate energy of someone selling timeshares in a burning building. His name was Alexios Angelos. He was approximately 20 years old, and he was, technically speaking, the rightful heir to the Byzantine throne. This last claim required some creative interpretation of Byzantine succession law, but he was willing to overlook the details if everyone else would. His story was genuinely pathetic. His father, Isaac II, had been emperor until 1195, when Isaac's own brother had overthrown him, blinded him with hot irons, and thrown him in prison. Standard Byzantine politics, really. The usurper, now Alexios III, ruled Constantinople while the legitimate heir grew up in captivity until managing to escape, fleeing westward in search of anyone willing to help him reclaim his inheritance. Western courts had shown polite interest and offered nothing concrete. Alexios had bounced between Rome, Germany, and various noble houses, making his pitch and collecting sympathy rather than soldiers. But now, camped in Zara, he found something remarkable: an entire army that needed exactly what he claimed to offer. The proposal was elegantly comprehensive. Help him take Constantinople. Not sack it, merely help him reclaim what was rightfully his, and he would solve every problem the crusade faced. 200,000 silver marks to pay all debts and finance the Egyptian campaign. 10,000 Byzantine soldiers to join the crusade. Provisions for the entire army. Submission of the Eastern Church to Rome, healing the schism that had divided Christendom for a century and a half. It was everything wrapped in a bow, requiring only a small detour. The Crusade's leadership listened with the attentiveness of men who had no other options. Debate followed, though the outcome was never truly in doubt. The pious faction argued that Constantinople was a Christian city and attacking it would compound their existing sins. The practical faction noted that they were already excommunicated, already broke, and already stuck. A certain Boniface of Montferrat, who had connections to Byzantine noble families and may have been positioning himself for a throne of his own, argued enthusiastically for the plan. The Venetians offered no objection whatsoever. Dandolo's quiet satisfaction went largely unremarked. Constantinople was where he had lost his sight decades ago. Constantinople was where Venetian merchants had been massacred in 1182. Constantinople controlled every trade route Venice needed and set every tariff Venice paid. The Blind Doge had been presented with an army willing to solve his republic's greatest strategic problem while believing they were doing God's work. The treaty was signed. Young Alexios had purchased an army on credit, promising Byzantine funds he didn't possess to pay Venetian debts he didn't owe for a throne he couldn't hold. The fleet prepared to sail for the Queen of Cities. God's warriors were going to Constantinople for purely humanitarian reasons. To understand what happened next, one must understand what Constantinople actually was in 1203. Not the declining remnant of later centuries, but the greatest city in the Christian world by virtually every measure that mattered. 400,000 people lived within its walls. Paris, at this time, held perhaps 50,000. London fewer. Rome had shrunk to a village haunting its ancient monuments. Constantinople was a functioning metropolis of a scale Western Europe had forgotten was possible. Forums still in use, aqueducts still running, libraries still lending, an economy still producing silk and gold and everything that made civilization worth the trouble. The city sat at the hinge of continents. Every trade route between Europe and Asia passed through or around it. Spices from India, silk from China, furs from Russia, grain from Egypt. All of it funneled through the Bosphorus, through Constantinople's harbors, past Constantinople's customs officials. Whoever controlled the city controlled medieval globalization. Venice understood this with painful clarity. Venetian merchants had operated in Constantinople for centuries, technically as privileged partners, practically as supplicants. Byzantine emperors granted trading rights and revoked them. Byzantine officials assessed duties that fluctuated with diplomatic weather. The massacre of 1182 had made the stakes explicit. Latins murdered in the streets, survivors sold into slavery, Venetian warehouses burned. Constantinople wasn't just a competitor. It was an existential threat wearing a trading partner's mask. From the deck of a Venetian galley approaching in June 1203, the city announced itself in stages. First, the seawalls stretching impossibly along the shore. Then the domes. Hagia Sophia rising above everything, a geometric impossibility that had stood for 7 centuries. Then the harbors, the Golden Horn curving inland, protected by the chain that could seal the entire inlet against hostile fleets. The Crusaders, most of whom had never seen a city larger than Paris or Venice, fell silent. Geoffrey of Villehardouin, the expedition's chronicler, recorded that there was not a man bold enough not to tremble at the sight. They had expected a city. This was a civilization made physical. The triple walls on the landward side had never been breached. Not by Persians, not by Arabs, not by the various armies that had battered themselves against Constantinople for 800 years. The seawalls were lower but defended by the same citizen who had built the commercial empire within. A population with everything to lose. Dandolo observed the approaching walls with whatever senses remained to him. He had walked these streets before he lost his sight. He knew the warehouses, the customs houses, the palaces where Byzantine officials had smiled while adjusting tariffs upward. He was 93 years old, leading an army of debtors against the greatest city on earth. He had waited decades for this. A few more weeks would be nothing. The first siege of Constantinople began on July 17, 1203, and it succeeded far more quickly than anyone had a right to expect. This would prove to be the worst thing that could have happened. The assault combined naval and land operations with surprising coordination. The Crusaders attacked across the Golden Horn while Venetian galleys assaulted the seawalls directly. Ships converted into floating siege towers, their masts fitted with flying bridges that could reach the wall tops. Dandolo himself stood at the prow of the lead galley, blind and ancient and apparently uninterested in the concept of personal safety. When his men hesitated, he reportedly demanded they put him ashore first, banner of St. Mark in hand. The Venetians took a section of the seawall. Fire spread through the adjacent quarter. Emperor Alexios III, watching the flames and calculating his odds, made a decision that surprised everyone. He gathered what portable treasury he could find and fled the city in the night. He simply left. The Byzantine army woke to find their emperor gone and their strategic situation meaningless. The defenders, leaderless, open negotiations. Isaac II was released from his dungeon, blinking in light he hadn't seen in 8 years, and restored to his throne. Young Alexios was crowned co-emperor as Alexios IV. The Crusaders had won. They had placed their candidate on the throne of the Roman Empire. Now he simply had to pay them. The problem became apparent almost immediately. The Byzantine treasury held perhaps 100,000 marks. Alexios had promised 200,000. His father's former officials explained, with varying degrees of patience, that the funds did not exist, had never existed, and could not be conjured through imperial optimism. The previous government had spent lavishly. The current government had inherited debts. Alexios IV did what desperate rulers do. He improvised. Church silver was melted down, sacred icons stripped of their precious metal. This solved approximately nothing while creating powerful domestic enemies. The clergy, already suspicious of a ruler installed by Latin heretics, now had proof of his sacrilege. The population, watching foreigners camp outside their walls while their new emperor robbed their churches, drew the obvious conclusions. Tension spiraled through the autumn and winter. Crusaders, still awaiting payment, conducted increasingly aggressive foraging expeditions. A group of them accidentally on purpose set fire to a mosque in the city, and the fire spread, destroying a substantial portion of Constantinople. Greeks attacked Latins in the streets. Alexios IV, caught between creditors who wanted money and subjects who wanted him dead, satisfied no one. The young emperor sent increasingly desperate messages to the Crusader camp. Be patient. Funds were coming. The situation was complex. Byzantine bureaucracy required time. The Crusaders looked at their dwindling supplies and calculated how much patience they could afford. By January 1204, the arrangement had collapsed beyond any hope of repair. Alexios IV was trapped in a nightmare of compound obligations. He owed the Crusaders money he didn't have. He owed his subjects protection from the Crusaders he couldn't provide. And he owed his throne to an army that was rapidly reconsidering whether he was worth keeping. The emperor's attempts to raise funds had succeeded only in unifying opposition against him. Church treasures melted into bullion bought months at most. New taxes enraged a population already hostile. The fire that Crusaders had started in August had destroyed entire neighborhoods, displacing thousands who blamed the foreigners and, by extension, the emperor who had invited them. Constantinople's streets buzzed with conspiracy. The coup came at the end of January. A court official named Alexios Doukas, nicknamed Mortsouflos for his prominently joined eyebrows because Byzantine politics never lacked for colorful detail, led a palace takeover. He found the young Emperor Alexios IV in his chambers and strangled him personally. Isaac II, the restored father, died shortly afterward in his prison cell, either murdered or simply giving up after watching his final hope collapse. Mortsouflos took the throne as Alexios V. His policy toward the Crusaders was refreshingly direct. No payment, no negotiation, no acknowledgement of any obligation whatsoever. The previous emperor's promises died with the previous emperor. The Crusaders should leave, immediately, with nothing. This presented the expedition's leadership with a clarifying dilemma. They had invested 2 years and every resource they possessed in this detour. They were still in debt to Venice. They were still excommunicated. Their candidate was dead, their treaty void, their position untenable. Going home meant admitting complete failure. Sailing to Egypt meant sailing into hostile territory with inadequate supplies and no prospect of reinforcement. Staying meant starvation. There was, however, a fourth option. The Crusaders had seen the wealth of Constantinople with their own eyes. They had watched icons being stripped. They had heard estimates of the treasuries, the churches, the accumulated surplus of 8 centuries of empire. They were owed money. Whether by the dead emperor or the living empire became a theological question the army was not inclined to debate. And they had already proven at Zara that their crosses could accommodate mission flexibility. Venice supported the proposal with enthusiasm. The partition treaty, the division of anticipated spoils, was drawn up in March before the walls were breached. Both parties agreed how to split an empire they didn't yet own, 3/8 to Venice, 3/8 to whoever became emperor, the remaining quarter funding the expedition. They allocated neighborhoods, islands, trading posts, all of it mapped and assigned while the city stood unconquered. The second siege would not end with negotiated restoration. This time, Constantinople would fall. The final assault came on April 12, 1204. The Venetian fleet attacked the seawalls while Crusader forces pressed from the land. Morzaflos had strengthened defenses, raised the wall towers, prepared his population for resistance. Constantinople had never fallen to assault. There was no reason to believe it would fall now. It fell. A section of seawall collapsed or was breached. Accounts vary, and Crusaders poured through. Morzaflos attempted to rally resistance, failed, and fled in the night, taking the path of his predecessor, and proving that some Byzantine traditions transcended individual emperors. By morning, the city's defenders had melted away. The greatest city in Christendom lay open. What followed was not random violence. It was organized atrocity, systematic and contractual, conducted by men who kept careful records. The 3-day sack of Constantinople was debt collection with compound interest, executed according to prearranged agreements. Each national contingent received assigned sectors. Venetians took the harbor districts they knew intimately from decades of trading. French and Flemish crusaders swept through the wealthy neighborhoods and palace complexes. Everything portable was gathered. Church plate, private wealth, holy relics, anything that could be melted, sold, or venerated. The division would come later. For 3 days, the gathering was general. The smell of burning libraries drifted through the streets. Manuscripts that had survived since antiquity. Greek philosophy, Roman law, scientific treatises preserved nowhere else. Became ash because no one thought to value them. Soldiers who couldn't read Latin, much less Greek, saw parchment as kindling or packing material. 8 centuries of accumulated knowledge scattered to the winds and the flames. churches suffered particular attention. Hagia Sophia, the greatest church in Christendom, was comprehensively looted. The altar, solid silver encrusted with precious stones, was broken apart for easier transport. Mules were brought inside to carry out the debris. A prostitute, according to Byzantine accounts, was placed on the patriarch's throne to sing bawdy songs while soldiers distributed communion vessels as drinking cups. The bronze horses of the hippodrome, ancient Greek sculptures that had stood for centuries, were carefully dismounted and loaded onto Venetian ships. They would spend the next 800 years in Venice above the entrance to St. Mark's Basilica, a permanent reminder of what patience and compound interest could achieve. Relics flooded westward in quantities that should have raised theological questions. Pieces of the true cross multiplied as if through divine intervention or creative carpentry. The crown of thorns eventually reached Paris. Saints' bones distributed across every noble chapel that could afford them. Constantinople's sacred inventory became Europe's spiritual stock exchange. The screams came in Greek. Fellow Christians pleading with fellow Christians in a language most crusaders couldn't understand. Nuns were violated in convents. Noble households were murdered for their gold, the categories that supposedly mattered. Christian versus infidel, civilized versus barbarian, dissolved entirely in the face of easier distinctions. Armed versus unarmed, rich versus dead. After 3 days, the leaders called a halt. Not from mercy, but from diminishing returns. The city had been efficiently processed. Constantinople still stood, physically, but everything that had made it Constantinople was gone or burning or on its way to Venice. With the looting complete, the business of empire building could begin. The Crusaders and Venetians gathered to implement the partition treaty they had drafted months before. The Partitio Terrarum Imperii Romaniae, a document that reads less like a peace treaty than a corporate merger agreement. The empire's territories were divided with the precision of accountants settling an estate. Venice received 3/8 of Constantinople itself, including the most commercially valuable districts along the Golden Horn. The Republic also collected Crete, strategic islands throughout the Aegean, key ports along the Greek coast, and trading privileges that amounted to a Mediterranean monopoly. Dandolo had not come for glory. He had come for logistics, and logistics he received. The remaining territory required an emperor. After considerable negotiation, Baldwin of Flanders won the throne, partly because he was broadly acceptable and partly because Venice preferred a weak Latin ruler to a strong one. Baldwin I, Count of Flanders, became Emperor of Constantinople, though what he actually ruled was rubble, resentment, and an impossible military situation. The Latin Empire, as historians would later call it, was stillborn. Its territory was fragmentary, its resources exhausted, its population hostile. Greek successor states emerged almost immediately. The Empire of Nicaea in Anatolia, the Despotate of Epirus in the west, the Empire of Trebizond on the Black Sea coast. Baldwin controlled his capital and a patchwork of besieged outposts. He would be captured by Bulgarians within a year and die in their custody, probably murdered. Dandolo did not live to see the full fruits of his labor, but he came close. He died in Constantinople in May 1205, having witnessed the humiliation of Venice's greatest rival. He was buried in Hagia Sophia, a Venetian doge entombed in the greatest church of Eastern Christianity. a final insult that would endure until the Ottoman conquest 2.5 centuries later. The Latin Empire staggered on until 1261, when the Byzantine Greeks recaptured Constantinople and restored their own emperor. But the restored empire was a shadow. Territories lost, population scattered, treasures vanished, libraries destroyed. Byzantium survived another 2 centuries, but the Fourth Crusade had inflicted wounds that never healed. When the Ottomans finally took the city in 1453, they conquered a diminished prize. Venice, by contrast, flourished. The Republic's commercial dominance of the Eastern Mediterranean lasted for the next 300 years. Venetian colonies dotted the Aegean. Venetian merchants controlled the spice trade. The Blind Doge's investment paid dividends for generations of shareholders. The bronze horses stood above St. Mark's, catching the Adriatic light. They stand there still, or copies do. The originals now sheltered inside. Either way, they remember. Constantinople doesn't need to. The memory has been outsourced. The Fourth Crusade never approached Jerusalem. Not once. Not even symbolically. 10,000 men who had sworn sacred oaths to liberate the Holy Sepulchre spent their crusade collecting on behalf of their creditors. First at Zara, then at Constantinople, and never anywhere that their vows actually specified. This was not a failure of religious conviction or an aberration of medieval piety. It was a demonstration of a principle that would prove remarkably durable. Debt structures determine outcomes regardless of stated missions. The Crusaders believed in their cause, genuinely, fervently, with the conviction of men who had left homes and families for God. Their belief changed nothing. They went where the money required them to go. Dandolo saw this clearly. He was old, blind, and positioned at the exact center of financial leverage. He understood that an army's stated purpose matters less than its balance sheet. He understood that piety, however sincere, bends toward solvency. He turned the crusade into a collection agency wearing crosses because he could see, metaphorically, if not literally, what the knights with functioning eyes could not, the shape of the obligation they had signed. The precedent echoes forward through history, though one should gesture at such echoes lightly. Wars announced for liberation have a tendency to secure trade routes instead. Expeditions launched for freedom find themselves protecting creditor interests. The names change. Democracy, civilization, humanitarian intervention. But the pattern remains familiar. Follow the debt contracts, not the propaganda. The contracts reveal the actual itinerary. The Crusaders themselves were not villains, particularly. They were men caught in a system that extracted obedience through obligation. Some protested at Zara. Some refused to participate in the sack. Most simply did what people do when trapped between conscience and consequence. They rationalized, they complied, they survived. The structure shaped the outcome. Individual morality barely registered. Venice preserved its records with characteristic diligence. The contracts that bound the Crusades still exist. Parchment yellowed but legible, terms precise, obligations clear. The crosses the soldiers wore rotted centuries ago. The sermons that inspired them have been forgotten. But the financial instruments survived because financial instruments always survive. They are the skeleton that remains when the body of noble intention has decomposed entirely. Dandolo's tomb in Hagia Sophia was destroyed by the Ottomans, who had no interest in preserving Venetian monuments. The bronze horses outlasted it. The trade routes outlasted both. The lesson outlasts everything. Holy wars are not immune to hostile takeovers. They are, in fact, particularly vulnerable to them, because their participants believe too strongly in the wrong things. They watch the crosses and miss the contracts. They hear the sermons and ignore the ledgers. They march toward Jerusalem and end up sacking Constantinople, wondering how exactly the map got redrawn while they were praying. The blind banker saw further. He always does. The sun bleeds orange over the rooftops of medieval Paris, and somewhere in the narrow passages near Les Halles, the city begins to change its clothes. The cobblestones here are slick with things best not examined too closely. Cabbage rot, animal offal, the accumulated moisture of 1,000 chamber pots emptied from windows above. The smell is dense enough to chew. Respectable Parisians quicken their pace through these streets during daylight, and by dusk, they've vanished entirely, scurrying back to neighborhoods where the gutters run slightly cleaner and the shadows contain fewer professional opportunities. But as evening settles into the cramped courtyards and timber-framed buildings of the Cour des Miracles, something remarkable begins to happen. The blind man who spent the afternoon stationed near Notre Dame, milky-eyed and trembling, reaches up and carefully removes 2 small prosthetics from his eye sockets. He blinks, stretches, and his gaze sharpens into something alert and calculating. The cripple who dragged himself through the Latin Quarter on twisted legs stands upright, rolls his shoulders, and walks. Walks. Toward the smell of cooking onions. The leper whose weeping sores sent pious women scrambling for their coin purses peels away patches of carefully crafted false skin, revealing underneath a complexion that's merely ordinary. This is the miracle of the Court of Miracles. Not divine intervention, but the end of a workday. The gates close with the satisfied thunk of timber against stone, and the atmosphere transforms. Wine appears. Not good wine. Let's not get romantic about this, but wine nonetheless, passed in clay cups between performers shedding their professional misery like actors leaving a stage. Cooking fires crackle in the courtyards, sending up the smell of whatever could be acquired that day. Turnips, mostly, occasionally meat of questionable origin, bread that's more determination than flour. Laughter echoes through the narrow passages. Genuine laughter, not the wheedling gratitude of the afternoon's performance. Children chase each other between buildings, some of them still wearing the strategic dirt of their daytime roles as pitiful orphans, now shrieking with an energy that would have ruined any carefully cultivated image of starvation. The Court of Miracles was not one place but several. Perhaps a dozen scattered through Paris at the height of its operation. Each a walled pocket of impossible geography where the city's official rules simply stopped applying. The largest sprawled near the Philidou convent, a cruel irony that the church seems not to have appreciated. High walls, narrow entrances, a maze of passages designed to confuse pursuit. And you entered a jurisdiction older than the king's law. And here's the part that tends to surprise people. It wasn't chaos. It was a company town, a guild hall. A professional association with standards, hierarchies, and employee benefits that would make a medieval tradesman's eyes water with envy. The men and women unwinding in the torchlit courtyards weren't criminals in the modern sense. Or rather, they weren't only criminals. They were craftspeople, specialists, career professionals in an industry as old as cities themselves. The industry of human pity. The coins being counted in the flickering light weren't stolen. They were earned. Earned through techniques passed down through generations, through apprenticeships lasting years, through a sophisticated understanding of human psychology that any modern marketing department would immediately try to hire. But we'll get to the craft. First, we need to understand what they were selling. Medieval charity was not optional. Let's be clear about that. The church taught, and medieval Christians genuinely believed, that giving alms was essential to salvation. Not helpful, not admirable, essential. The wealthy man who passed a beggar without offering coin wasn't just being rude, he was actively gambling with his immortal soul. Every uncharitable act was a small step toward an eternity of creative punishment. This created, in economic terms, an extremely motivated buyer. The beggars of Paris understood this the way a modern salesperson understands commission structures. They weren't asking for charity. They were offering a product. The product was an opportunity for the giver to feel righteous, to purchase a small installment on heavenly real estate, to transform material wealth into spiritual credit. The beggar was performing a service. But here's the problem: everyone else was offering the same service. Medieval Paris swarmed with people seeking alms. The genuine poor, the temporarily unfortunate, the professionally strategic. They crowded the church steps, the market squares, the bridges over the Seine. Competition was fierce. Pity was a finite resource, and the average Parisian had only so much guilt available on any given afternoon. So the successful beggar needed to stand out. Not through desperation. Everyone was desperate, real or performed, and desperation alone triggered compassion fatigue. The successful beggar needed technique, timing, an understanding of which Parisians gave most readily, at what hours, in response to which emotional appeals. The merchant's wife leaving Mass responded to religious imagery. The student in the Latin Quarter responded to clever wordplay. The foreign visitor responded to being singled out as someone clearly more generous than these tight-fisted locals. Amateur beggars sat in the cold and hoped. Professionals studied their audience, workshopped their approach, refined their presentation. They understood that they weren't in the poverty business. They were in the feelings business. And feelings, as it turns out, can be manufactured. Specialization was extraordinary. Modern observers tend to imagine medieval beggars as an undifferentiated mass of misery, ragged figures with outstretched hands, interchangeable in their poverty. This is roughly equivalent to imagining that all modern tech workers do the same job. The Court of Miracles operated with a division of labor that would impress a German automotive factory. The Kagas specialized in epileptic fits. They could drop to the cobblestones at precisely the right moment, foam artfully at the mouth, thrash with convincing violence while somehow never actually injuring themselves, and recover just enough to weakly accept coins while still appearing on the edge of another seizure. This wasn't improvisation. A convincing fake seizure requires months of practice. The timing of the fall, the rhythm of the tremors, the gradual return to awareness. Get it wrong and you look like a bad actor. Get it very wrong and you crack your skull on the pavement. The Kagis train their children from toddlerhood. The Malingru were wound specialists. Their art was makeup. The creation of fake sores, tumors, and disfigurements so convincing that even physicians sometimes offered treatment instead of coins. They worked with animal blood, bile, carefully prepared mixtures that mimicked the appearance of infection. Small bladders hidden under clothing could be squeezed to produce bleeding at dramatic moments. Prosthetic additions suggested missing limbs or gangrenous extremities. A master malingru could create a wound that smelled authentic, which requires a certain commitment to the craft that deserves acknowledgement, if not admiration. The Pietra performed physical disability. They bound limbs into positions that suggested paralysis or deformity, trained their muscles to hold uncomfortable poses for hours, developed walks and movements suggesting injury so specific that observers imagined particular tragic accidents. Some specialized in military wounds, positioning themselves to catch veterans' sympathies. Others focused on childhood diseases, curling adult bodies into shapes suggesting conditions present from birth. The Franks Me Too faked illness, consumption, plague scares, wasting diseases that required no visible wounds but demanded convincing physical deterioration. They mastered the cough, the pallor, the weakness that made healthy observers uncomfortable enough to hurry a coin and move along quickly. The Capons served as informants and boundary enforcers, a quasi-police force within the court. The orphelins were children trained in the production of tears, coached to approach marks with faces of devastating innocence, whimpering about parents lost to war, disease, or simply the cruel economy of the age. Each specialty required apprenticeship. This wasn't metaphorical. Children were literally apprenticed to master practitioners, learning techniques over years before being permitted to operate independently. A young would-be Kagis might spend 2 years learning to fall without injury, another year refining the foam production, another mastering the timing. A Malingro apprentice studied anatomy, learned the recipes for fake infection, practiced applying prosthetics in low light at speed. Quality control was enforced by the guild structure. A poorly executed performance reflected badly on the entire specialty, attracted unwanted attention, and wasted valuable territory. The irony was sharp enough to cut. The professional beggars of the Court of Miracles had more rigorous training, clearer advancement paths, and better professional standards than most legitimate trades in medieval Paris. The Bakers' Guild would have taken notes if they'd known. But perhaps the most sophisticated element wasn't the individual techniques. It was the system that coordinated them. Someone had to be in charge. And in the Court of Miracles, that someone was elected. The Grand Coesra, the Beggar King, ruled not by birth or conquest, but by something that would have horrified legitimate medieval monarchs: popular vote. The practitioners of the court gathered, debated, and chose their leader through a democratic process that predated meaningful parliamentary representation in France by several centuries. Candidates campaigned. They made promises about territory allocation, about protection from authorities, about fair distribution of the court's collective resources. They emphasize their experience, their connections, their ability to maintain the delicate balance between profitable operation and attracting too much attention from the actual king's forces. The Grand Coesre, once elected, held genuine power. He mediated disputes between specialties, allocated prime begging territory, negotiated, when necessary, with city authorities who found it easier to manage the court than eliminate it, and administered justice faster and more consistently than the royal courts managed. Below him operated a cabinet of lieutenants. The archiesapotes oversaw individual specialty guilds, ensuring standards were maintained and apprenticeships properly conducted. The Kagos, not to be confused with the Kagos specialty, served as territorial governors, managing specific districts of Paris where begging rights had been assigned. The Coesre's council included representatives from each major guild, a proto-parliamentary structure that would have caused political theorists to revise several centuries of assumptions about the origins of representative government. Territory was sacred. Paris was carved into districts, each assigned to specific practitioners or family groups, and boundaries were enforced with a violence that made intellectual property lawyers look like pacifists. Work someone else's corner without permission, and the capons would find you. First offense might be a beating and confiscation of the day's earnings. Second offense might be exile from the court entirely. A professional death sentence that left the offender competing against organized specialists with no support structure, no network, no protection. Third offense was sometimes simply a corpse floating in the Seine. Within the court's walls, laws applied that would seem paradoxical to outsiders. No stealing from fellow residents. Debts were honored. The Coesre's court heard cases and rendered judgments that parties actually obeyed. Violence against women and children without authorization was punished severely. There was in this kingdom of performed poverty and strategic deception a genuine ethical code. It wasn't gentle, but it was consistent. Petitioners appeared before the Grand Coesre to appeal territory decisions, to resolve partnership disputes, to register apprenticeships, to complain about competitors encroaching on their specialty. Justice was rendered quickly, often within the same evening. Compare this to the royal courts, where a property dispute might languish for years, where judges could be bribed, where outcomes depended heavily on which party had better connected relatives. The beggars had built, in the shadows of legitimate Paris, a state that worked. Which is not to romanticize it. The state that worked was built on exploitation, on the training of children for lives of deception, on the systematic manipulation of human compassion for profit. But functioning systems have a way of persisting. And the Court of Miracles persisted for centuries precisely because it offered something its residents couldn't find elsewhere: predictability. Here's a number that should recalibrate expectations. A skilled professional beggar in medieval Paris could earn more than a journeyman craftsman. Not always, not every day, but consistently enough that families chose this profession not out of absolute desperation, but out of rational economic calculation. The Court of Miracles wasn't a last resort. For many, it was a first choice. The economics were surprisingly sophisticated. New practitioners paid entry fees for territory rights, for guild membership, for access to the court's protection and infrastructure. Equipment was available for rental, high-quality prosthetics for those who couldn't afford their own, costumes, the makeup supplies necessary for convincing wound creation. The court operated in modern terms as both franchise system and equipment leasing company. Daily earnings were subject to taxation. A percentage went to the territorial Kogo, another percentage to the Grand Coessery's central administration. In exchange, practitioners received dispute resolution, protection from external authorities. The court maintained relationships with certain city officials who found cooperation more profitable than crackdowns, and access to the information network that allowed the court to function. Prime territory cost more. A spot near Notre Dame on a feast day commanded premium rates. A corner in a struggling neighborhood could be acquired cheaply but produced accordingly. Practitioners bought, sold, and inherited territories through a property market as active as any legitimate real estate exchange. The most successful performers accumulated genuine wealth. Not noble-level fortunes. Let's not exaggerate. But comfortable prosperity. Enough to own property, to hire apprentices, to establish their children in advantageous positions within the guild system. Some eventually retired into legitimate trades, their years of savings providing startup capital for businesses that asked no questions about the source. The irony requires acknowledgement. Performing absolute poverty was a reliable path to relative prosperity. The coins dropped by pitying Parisians accumulated into sums that those same Parisians, struggling with legitimate trades and legitimate taxes, might have envied. Investment in children's training made economic sense. A child properly apprenticed to a master malingru would, within a few years, begin generating returns. Family enterprises spanning generations became common. The skills, the territories, the professional relationships, all inheritable assets. Poverty, weaponized correctly, was lucrative. But like any profession, the performance itself was labor. And labor, even labor that looks like doing nothing, has costs that deserve examination. Creating a convincing fake wound is harder than it sounds. It sounds like it would be hard. It's harder than that. The malingru kept recipes the way chefs guard signature dishes. Animal blood needed to be treated to prevent coagulation at the wrong moment. Too fresh, and it clotted unconvincingly. Too old, and the smell became actively counterproductive. Bile provided the yellowish tinge of infection. Certain plant extracts created irritation that produced genuine redness and swelling around the fake lesion, blending prosthetic and flesh in ways that fooled close inspection. Small bladders from animals, filled with blood mixtures, could be concealed under clothing and squeezed at dramatic moments. A beggar whose wound suddenly began bleeding fresh drew instant attention and, more importantly, instant charity. The timing required practice. Too early and the effect was wasted, too late and the mark had already passed. The prosthetics themselves were miniature engineering projects. False tumors needed to match skin tone, to move naturally with the body, to withstand hours of wear without detaching at embarrassing moments. Missing fingers were created through carefully positioned cloth wrappings that concealed actual digits while presenting convincing stumps. Missing limbs required more elaborate arrangements, bound beneath clothing, positioned to create silhouettes suggesting absence where presence actually existed. Physical training for the Pietra was demanding in ways that seemed counterintuitive. Holding a contorted position for hours without muscle tremors, without breaks, without the small movements that would betray healthy capability. This required conditioning that athletes might respect. Some practitioners developed genuine deformities over time, their bodies conforming to positions held so consistently that the performance became reality. The voice could be trained. Certain pathetic quavers, certain catches in the breath, certain tones that triggered automatic sympathy. These could be practiced until they became automatic. Children particularly were coached in the production of tears, not through emotional recall but through technique, specific ways of holding the eyes, the face, that produced moisture on demand. And here's the detail that tends to unsettle modern audiences. Practitioners were proud of this work. Not in a villainous, hand-rubbing way. In the way that any skilled craftsperson takes pride in doing difficult things well. The master Mullingrew, who created a wound that fooled a physician, felt genuine professional satisfaction. The Cagus, whose seizure prompted a crowd to gather, genuinely frightened, had accomplished something that required talent. The orphan child, who could produce tears within seconds of approaching a mark, possessed a skill that took years to develop. These techniques were family heritage. Passed from parent to child, refined over generations, guarded against competitors. The DuPont family. Not their real name, records being what they are. Might have specialized in wound work for a century, each generation contributing innovations to the family craft. It was art. Terrible art, exploitative art, art built on manipulating human empathy for money. But art nonetheless. And like all art, it required an audience. The Court of Miracles was, among its many functions, the closest thing medieval Paris had to neutral territory. Nobles came slumming. This was an open secret. Young aristocrats seeking thrills, older ones seeking information or services unavailable in polite society. Within the court's walls, birth mattered less than coin. A duke's son could drink alongside a professional cripple, and the professional cripple might be wealthier, might have better connections in certain useful quarters, might know things about certain useful people. The beggars knew everything. Think about it. They were everywhere, watching everyone, and they were invisible. The wealthy walked past them without a second glance, conducting conversations they assumed no one important could overhear. Lovers arranged assignations, merchants discussed schemes, politicians made promises, all within earshot of figures assumed to be too wretched to matter. The court became Paris's intelligence exchange. Information was a secondary currency, sometimes more valuable than the coins collected from Mark. Who was sleeping with whom? Which merchant was overextended? Which official could be bribed? Which noble was accumulating debts? All this flowed through the court's network, available for the right price. Prostitutes used the court as safe haven, a place where their earnings couldn't be seized by pimps or authorities. Fences moved stolen goods through channels that led in and out of the court's walls. Forgers found clients. Actual poets, there are records, found audiences willing to listen without the constraints of legitimate patronage. the social mixing was impossible anywhere else in medieval Paris. The legitimate city was stratified in ways modern readers sometimes underestimate. Guild members associated with guild members, merchants with merchants, nobles with nobles. The church maintained its own social universe. Everyone knew their place and everyone stayed in it. Within the court, place was earned, not inherited. A successful Cagus commanded more respect than a failed noble. A shrewd territorial Cagot held more actual power than many legitimate officials. For hours between dusk and dawn, the hierarchies of the outside world temporarily dissolved into a different organizing principle: competence. This wasn't equality. The court had its own hierarchies, its own oppressions, its own abuses of power. But it was a different inequality. One where the rules were at least visible, at least negotiable, at least occasionally subject to change. Small wonder that some residents chose the court over legitimate society, even when other options existed. Small wonder, too, that legitimate society eventually decided the court had to go. In the gray hours before sunrise, the Court of Miracles stirred toward a different kind of waking. The wine was gone. The laughter had faded into snoring, into the restless sleep of bodies pressed together in cramped quarters, into the pre-dawn silence that settles over any human settlement before the work begins again. Now came the transformation in reverse. Children sat still while parents applied strategic dirt. Not too much, which looked theatrical, but enough to suggest weeks without washing. The Molyneux mixed their morning recipes, preparing fresh wounds that would need to last through a long day of exposure. The Pietres stretched carefully, warming muscles that would soon be locked into positions of apparent paralysis. The Cagus practiced their falls one more time, ensuring the day's first seizure would be convincing. There was ritual in it. A kind of meditation, even. The masks went on with the same care a knight might have used donning armor. Each false sore, each rehearsed tremble, each calculated ragged edge of costume represented a role to be inhabited fully, without break, for 12 or 14 hours. This was the labor that medieval critics never acknowledged. Performing misery is exhausting. Maintaining a facade of suffering while actually suffering the cold, the hunger, the physical strain of impossible postures. This was work. Real work. Work that extracted costs even as it generated income. The court's residents knew they were manipulating compassion for profit. They knew their marks believed in suffering that was largely fictional. They knew, too, that the line between performance and reality was thinner than comfortable. Plenty of court residents had genuine hardships, genuine injuries, genuine reasons for desperation. The performance simply amplified what was already, to some degree, true. This nuance was lost on Louis XIV. The Sun King wanted order. He wanted visible power. He wanted a Paris that reflected his glory, and the courts of miracles, plural by then, spread through multiple neighborhoods, reflected something else entirely. They reflected a city that had spaces beyond royal control, populations that governed themselves, economies that paid no taxes to the crown. In 1656, Louis established the Hôpital General. Not a hospital in the modern sense, but a system of forced confinement for beggars, vagrants, and anyone else whose visible poverty embarrassed the capital. The courts were raided. Residents were seized, imprisoned, set to forced labor. The walls came down. The territories were erased. The professional beggars scattered. Some to prison, some to other cities, some into legitimate poverty that they could no longer strategically perform. An entire social system, centuries in development, was dismantled within a decade. What was lost? This is the question that itches. The obvious answer: a criminal enterprise built on exploitation. The court trained children for lives of deception, manipulated the charitable instincts of honest citizens, operated outside laws designed to maintain social order. Good riddance, the 17th century concluded. But also lost was a certain kind of freedom. The freedom to be bad at respectable society, but good at something else. The freedom to build alternative structures when legitimate ones excluded you. The freedom, however compromised, however problematic, to choose your own performance. Modern readers might recognize the pattern. The gig economy runs on performed authenticity. The Uber driver maintains a 5-star personality, whether exhausted, furious, or heartbroken. The Instagram influencer curates suffering for engagement, vulnerability as content strategy. The GoFundMe campaign optimizes its narrative for maximum emotional impact, knowing that amateur desperation loses to professional technique. We still perform poverty or trauma or struggle, calibrated for audiences we need to move. We still understand that feelings are products, that compassion responds to craft, that the line between genuine need and strategic presentation blurs beyond recovery. The Court of Miracles didn't invent this. They simply industrialized it early. Somewhere in the algorithms that determine which crowdfunding campaigns go viral, somewhere in the training that teaches influencers to cry on camera at optimal moments, somewhere in the calculation of which personal tragedy will generate the most engagement, the Grand Coesre would recognize his own profession. The buildings are gone. The territories are long since paved over, replaced by Parisian streets where tourists walk without knowing they're treading on guild halls for professional suffering. The recipes for fake wounds are lost, the techniques for convincing seizures forgotten. But the craft of curated authenticity, that survived just fine.